My friends, I hope your seminar discussions this morning with your colleagues satisfied some questions, opened some new avenues of thought, and left you with more ideas that you want to explore about our nation's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the idea that Lincoln brought to light about disunity having dire consequences. To further those conversations, I'm pleased to welcome our guest speaker today. I first became acquainted with Dr. Anderson when I attended his lecture on teaching American history at last spring's symposium put on by the Institute for Classical Education in Phoenix. In his talk, he mentioned called the Declaration of Independence and God, Self-Evident Truths in American Law. And since I was in the middle of taking a master's class called Great American Speeches, I decided that that book needed to be purchased. And I immediately ordered it, and as you can see, I have devoured it and tabbed it and folded it back, and I even lost its ability to stay together in one piece. To say the least, it was a really wonderful read. I learned things about our founding documents, the history of natural law, and the basic epistemology of our country's foundational truths that my American education, unfortunately, had never afforded me. As I worked with our professional development team to come up with a theme and a structure for this year's series of PD Days, I wondered how many of my Grey Hearts colleagues were as poor as I was in the knowledge and understanding of our natal histories. That passion to share my newfound knowledge pushed me to go out on a limb and contact Dr. Anderson to see if he'd make this journey to San Antonio despite the pandemic. If you've not yet been convinced by my commendations of our speaker to our purpose here today, here are a few of his words from the preface of his book about his motivation for research and writing. Wanting to know what is the highest good motivates these books. Early in my studies of philosophy, I came to recognize the difference between having an opinion, even a true opinion, and having knowledge. The many attempts to explain the difference between knowledge and opinion often bypass the role of reason in showing what is clear. In topics such as God and the good, there are many competing beliefs or opinions. If we are responsible for knowing what is good, then it must be clear to reason what is good. Dr. Anderson comes from Arizona State University, where he is currently a professor of philosophy and religious studies. He received 2 bachelor's degrees, one in philosophy and one in history, 2 masters in philosophy and in religious studies, and a PhD, all at Arizona State University. And if you doubt this credibility in speaking today because of my obvious bias towards being a Sun Devil, Headmaster Vlavich, he was also a researcher at Princeton University from 2013-14. Among the many articles and books he has written, he has tackled the topics of Aristotelian and Thomistic concepts of law, ethics of belief, world religions and common ground, as well as the problem of evil. Most recently, he has been named a fellow at the Institute for Classical Education, where he is currently writing an ongoing series on the Academy. Please help me welcome Dr. Owen Anderson.
Thank you. Let me get situated here. I have a lot of wires. Well, it was a wonderful introduction with music, right? Made me wonder, be a little nervous. I'm not sure I can follow that up. Remember what Shakespeare said in the Merchant of Venice? He who does not have music in his soul is good for treason, stratagems, and spoils. Do not trust him. So I looked around to make sure everyone was clapping and enjoying the music. And it looks like you do have music in your soul, which is good. Now, let me do introduction to my talk by just suggesting or pointing out a few of the books I've written. One is The Declaration of Independence and God that we just mentioned to you. One is titled The Natural Moral Law, The Good After Modernity. And this is a good audience because you'll immediately recognize, if you were to see it up close, that there's Aeneas carrying his father Anchises from the flames of Troy. Not every audience notices that right away. And then more recently, the Cambridge Companion to the First Amendment and Religious Liberty. Yeah, thank you. All right. So I'm going to be discussing some things in our talk today from those books. Now, I don't imagine that anyone doubts we're living in tumultuous times. This is true because of the pandemic, but also because of cultural conflicts. And both of those are affecting our students. We've had to shut down our economy, and now we're trying to restart it. But even more pressing for us as educators is that we've had to shut down our schools, or in some cases modify our modes of teaching, and fit them to various kinds of distance learning. So this shakes everyone in education, right? From administration to faculty to students. Our goal here is to educate. And suddenly being required to alter our usual means of delivery of that education can make us wonder how fruitful the outcomes will be. And then in addition to those concerns about the pandemic, we have cultural conflicts. We have different values coming out and being expressed in different belief systems as they compete with each other, and sometimes violently. So I suspect that you got into teaching because you love the truth, and you want others to know that truth. You wanted to be able to help your students find meaning. But how do we do this in times like these? In a way that might seem kind of ironic, it is going to be potentially easier to get to what is important in education in times like this. What has happened is that a lack of foundation has been exposed, and it is exposed in a way that all can see. This is that which the culture wars are a symptom. And in order to illustrate this, I'm going to rely on Lincoln, on Madison, on the Declaration of Independence, and going back even further, John Winthrop. But before these, I want to share a quote from the theologian Paul Tillich, who was writing in about the middle of the 20th century. Yeah, good. So here's what he says. This is 1947. But he's talking about the pre-war years. First of all, a feeling of fear, more exactly of indefinite anxiety, was prevailing. Not only the economic and political, but also the cultural and religious. Security seemed to be lost. There was nothing on which one could build. Everything was without foundation. A catastrophic breakdown was expected at every moment. Consequently, a longing for security was growing in everybody. A freedom that leads to fear and anxiety had lost its value. What a miserable condition to be in. And I thought this quote captures our own condition pretty well. We too are in a miserable condition when we are without a foundation. But all is not lost if at first we recognize our condition. So he wrote this after 2 world wars. And you might think, well, those would get people's attention. Those would make people sit up and pay attention. But it wasn't enough. Here we are. And we still wonder what it will take to get people's attention. What he says is that there was a sense that everything was without foundation. There was nothing on which one could build. Brings to mind, of course, the parable of Christ. Building on sand, and as the storm strikes, the foundation is not sufficient, and the building crumbles. And he gives an order in the quote. He speaks of the political and economic, and I know those get most of our attention. But as a philosopher, you have a philosopher here with you today, I'm going to shift and look at some other things. And he mentions that, the political and economic, but then also the religious and cultural, which are more basic. Those feed the political and economic. Without just such a foundation, there can only be a catastrophic breakdown. And there had been for him, right, that he lived through 2 world wars. But was the foundation built after that? And I don't mean here a political pragmatism of diplomacy needed to avoid more world wars. We've been successful so far. Right? Come on, keep it up. But that foundation he is speaking of would go deeper. It gets to the meaning of things. And it's interesting that he's in a contrast here. I'm going to come back to this when we get to Lincoln. Freedom, which loses its value. It wasn't enough to get freedom. So do we have a foundation that will provide lasting meaning? This is what we want, and this is what we want to educate our students for. The foundation is those truths. Let me see, is that the next slide? Yes. The foundation is those truths necessary for the rest of the institutions of culture. Foundational questions, or the foundational truths, answer questions about knowledge and authority. Think about that, how those go together, right? If you say you know something and someone says, well, how do you know that? You appeal to something, right? You say you know a baseball fact. And they say, well, you know that. We have a baseball almanac to settle the matter. You say, Sun Devils have the best college football team. We don't even have to appeal to anybody. You just know that's true. Right? It's funny because I'm a professor at ASU, and it's funny because it's not true, unfortunately. You always want it to be true. So knowledge and authority go together, and reality, what is real, as opposed to what is fictional. That's really then a distinction between knowledge and opinion. That's why knowledge came first, and then reality, and then value. You want to know what is real so you know what to value, right? Can you imagine if one of your students or one of mine said, my goal in life is I'm going to go through my PhD and be a unicorn hunter. I say, well, that's very hard. There's only a few left. I say, no, that's just a fiction, right? You'd be basing your life, you'd be valuing something that's not real. So value based on what is real, which is based on what we can know. So one of the things we want to do for our students is to help them develop their sense of wonder by raising their awareness to the kinds of questions we can and should ask. And that's why the great books are so great, in part, because they do that so well. We can use these to help identify those basic beliefs, those foundational truths that we need to have in place to go on to build anything else. So some challenges we face I want to have with us. Increasing disagreement about what is true, beautiful, and good. It might be nice to think that I'm on the side that loves the true, beautiful, and good, and my opponents hate those things. But it's not that simple, is it? Now, as a matter of reality, someone may hate those things, but they don't think they do. Socrates goes over this in the Meno. You probably cover the Meno with your students, right? You think you're pursuing the true, the good, and the beautiful. I saw somebody discussing those who ahead of time I wouldn't gamble, but I would have bet that they'd say, I don't like truth, beauty, or goodness just because I understood their philosophy, and I saw them arguing about how America's lost sight of those things. And I almost passed out. Like that was the last person I thought would have been arguing about that. So we have a disagreement about those categories. It's not enough just to say I'm for truth and they're not. Or I care about beauty and they don't. And then second, widespread skepticism about our ability to know. There are only opinions. That's your opinion. That's what you think. And not knowledge. And without knowledge, we'll see there's no unity. And then the third, which is a consequence of the first two, a loss of meaning in all areas of life. Meaning at best becomes a subjective thing you infuse onto something for as long as it captures your attention. But things aren't actually meaningful. And this is nihilism. And with nihilism, you don't have any reason to support a culture or institutions. Nihilism. So I'm going to illustrate some important patterns in American thought from its beginning even down to the present. And we'll start in the middle with Lincoln in his Lyceum address, where he's dealing with a similar topic. How can we have lasting institutions? See how that's related to a foundation. The goal is the preservation of civil and religious liberties. And the answer to how to preserve them is to get to that lasting foundation. Those truths that we need to support such freedoms and institutions. And I think Lincoln is right about where destruction will come from. It's not from an external enemy. It's from within. It is due to self-destruction. He says it cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. as a nation of freemen, we must live through all time or die by suicide. And so that initial death by suicide comes in the third point I had up under the challenges, the loss of meaning. That's the suicide. Your institutions no longer provide you with meaning, or they do and you don't see it anymore. And there'd be no one then to defend them. No one's going to defend what's meaningless. And so they're dead. Dead to you. He then describes how this suicide takes place in the hands of the mob. Such are the effects of mob law, and such are the scenes becoming more and more frequent in this land, so lately famed for love of law and order, and the stories of which have even now grown too familiar to attract anything more than an idle remark. And also, thus then, by the operation of this Mobocratic Spirit, which became my new favorite word, Mobocratic Spirit, is now abroad in the land, the strongest bulwark of any government, and particularly of those constituted like ours, may effectually be broken down and destroyed. So does that sound like today? Does that sound like some distant time you're studying? It's hard to relate to them? Or you can see, well, that sounds like us, just like Paul Tillich sounded like us. Now we can imagine this, what he calls the Mobocratic Spirit, mostly in terms of violence. That might be what comes to mind. This is a kind of an external attack on a system of government or laws. And those kinds of attacks are dealt with by means different than education and philosophy. You don't call a philosopher in when you have those kinds of attacks. But there is still another sense of the Mobocratic Spirit that comes in the form of challenges to the foundation. These attacks are not merely in the spirit of want or greed. They're coming from a question about the meaning or meaninglessness of the foundational truths. Why build our lives on these? Such challenges ask. The answer could be a prudential one. These have worked for us so far, so they'll work for you also. But that doesn't actually get us to a lasting foundation. It might be that an insufficient foundation can last this long and then be exposed as empty or meaningless to the next generation. So that's what must be established. Have we gotten to that lasting foundation? Have we built on something permanent? The question occurs, this is from Lincoln again, how should we fortify against it? The answer is simple. Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country and never to tolerate their violation by others, as the patriots of '76 did to the support of the Declaration of Independence. So to the support of the Constitution and laws, let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and almanacs. So let the law be taught. It is education where that occurs. A commitment to law and to the teaching of this law at all levels. So it's returning to the foundation that needs to be taught in education to preserve those values. Remember that order I had between knowledge, reality, and value. And we might mostly think about the values we want to preserve, not think about the truths that we claim to base them on and the authority by which we claim to know. Now, he does say this, but I do mean to say that although bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed as soon as possible, still, while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed. There is no grievance that is a fit objection of redress by mob law. So some interesting juxtapositions in there in the words religiously observing these civil laws. And that's one of the themes I want to bring out in the texts I'm using, besides John Winthrop, who does appeal to revealed religion. These are revealing to natural religion. Now that's not the same as nature religion. You might know about Sedona in Arizona and think, oh, here we go. No. Natural religion means what we can know about God and the good from general revelation, from reason. So there are laws that are unjust, what he calls bad laws, what others have called unjust laws. And we can use means for repealing and replacing them rather than the action of a mob, which is really just the use of passion. And that's a theme we're going to go through today. See this juxtaposition between passion and reason, which is important in American thought. Now, of course, this requires we can know what is just and then measure the laws we have against justice. So the laws themselves aren't the highest. There's something else called justice that's higher. The laws aim at what is good, and so we have to know what is good in order to know if we have the right laws. This requires the foundational truths about the good and the just to be in place. It's easy to describe those we disagree with as being just merely controlled by their passions. And it's easy to make the mistake of thinking that there is a conflict between reason and passions instead of a fundamental conflict between reasons, between beliefs on which those passions rest. We should learn to assess the other in that way, where we can say, see them, what they're passionate about, but why? What do they think about reality that makes them passionate like that? So a person is passionate about or desires what they believe to be good. So we have our competing beliefs about what is good. And unity between people will require unity about what is good. And by this I mean not just goods, but our highest good. Summum bonum. That at which all things aim and for which all other things are done. We're all equally human, so we all share that same highest good for humans. And without this, we'll be arguing over competing goods and be divided. So he says that one of the buttresses against passion is a remembering of the history that laid the institutional foundation. But these are gone now. He says they were the pillars of the temple of liberty, and now that they have crumbled away, that temple must fall unless we, their descendants, supply their places with other pillars, hewn from the solid quarry of sober reason. And as I flew in yesterday, I saw some of the quarries here, which we don't have in Phoenix. I was impressed. And it gave this a little more meaning. Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. So again, we have some juxtapositions here between passion and reason. But it's interesting that he speaks of this temple of liberty, even metaphorically, as this raises the image of what is worshipped by this people as divine. You don't just put really neat things in temples, you put what you think is divine in a temple. Do we have unity about that? Like the good, we also have divisions about our understanding of God. What is the highest being? The highest being is the one that has existed from eternity. So what is eternal? And our highest good is connected to knowing that highest being. So when we start to see divisions come up about the highest being, we'll expect also divisions about what is good. Now he speaks about reason, calculating reason, or reason used to form arguments. But we're also divided today about reason, about what it is and its purpose. You could find those who would argue against reason. Now, in one sense, you can't, right? You'd be making an argument against that by which you make arguments. That's the transcendental nature of reason. It's the highest authority. Any argument you have, even if you're arguing against reason, you'd be using it. But more like reasons with an S, or reasoning. That's your reasoning, I have my reasoning. An unjust form of reasoning has saturated the institutions, some people say. And we have to get rid of reason, they might then say. And so they haven't been careful to distinguish between reasoning and reason and get rid of it. So there's an Enlightenment rationalism that used reason as a source of truth rather than as first a source of meaning. And it didn't notice the assumptions it had. In our teaching our students, we want to teach them the critical use of reason, to identify assumptions and test them for meaning. So here we already have the ideas, just by analyzing this, of the good, the highest being, and of reason and knowledge. And Lincoln isn't simply opposed to passions. He says they have helped us, but they can also be our enemy. And so presumably this depends, right, on whether the passions are aimed at what is good or not. So you might be passionate about something. That's even a phrase, right? My passion, that's my passion. But that you're passionate about it isn't licensed to do it. You'd have to know that it is aimed at the right end. or else it's aimed at a fiction. So instead of making an appeal to passions, we'd still have to make it to our understanding of what is good and mold those lessons into our students. That's what he says. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws. So from there, that's a good place to turn to the Declaration of Independence to get a picture of what this foundation looks like. Not all laws, I forgot to tell you to forward it. Yeah, so here's Lincoln, the perpetuation of our political institutions. And then the next one. And that's a quote I read. Apologize, I'll have to keep up on I was so engaged with you, I forgot there's slides behind me. And that's a quote I just read. Yeah, good. So here we are. So the laws themselves aren't the foundation. We should already kind of get a hint at that because you can have bad laws. There's something else by which you measure the laws. So law rests on the foundation. Law describes what we must do to get the good. It isn't the good, and insofar as it's not aimed at the good, it's unjust. Might be interesting to do have a senior paper comparing the Apology and the Credo, where Lincoln is more like the latter on this point. And Socrates, people try to unify Socrates in those two works. Because in the first one, he is willing to go against the laws. In the second one, he says he isn't. So when do you go against the laws? So the foundation gives us those truths necessary for law. And I might be partial, but I think the Declaration of Independence ranks highly among the world's great documents. Top 5, you can make me give a number. Second, was it second to the Magna Carta? If it improves on the Magna Carta, isn't it better than the Magna Carta? I don't know. So to teach our students what it means to think critically is to teach them to identify that foundation and know how to think about it. I'm going to use the Declaration as an illustration for that. But how we think critically, we notice what beliefs are there moving the rest of the argument. Beliefs aren't just a random scattering across the ground. I just throw beliefs out there and there they are. They're ordered. Systematically, they have logical relationships to each other. That's what I mean when I say more and less basic. Logically, some are down here at the basic level, and they support the rest. And it's part of helping students to notice that. So the Declaration of Independence is great because of how it illustrates that order I'm talking about right now. It doesn't appeal to divine inspiration or mythological origins. Those are distinct, I'm not collapsing those. But it does contain ideas about God. In fact, I'd argue that it contains important work in natural theology, which is why it is such a great document. And this is part of raising our own awareness of what kinds of questions can be asked in education. Because almost any time I speak about thinking about God, my area is philosophy of religion, students think, oh, that's religion, that's revealed religion. And those only mean the same thing, right? Well, no, there's also natural religion. What can be known by all persons we don't have to get yet to Genesis or to the Gospels. It doesn't mean we don't, but it doesn't mean all talk is only of that sort. That's too bad if education's been narrowed in that way, right? The Declaration of Independence doesn't have a footnote of chapter and verse, does it? Say, oh, okay, here's a chapter and verse which supports this argument. No, it's making a case from natural theology. And let's look at what the ideas it has. What role does God play in the Declaration? The Declaration is a declaration, right there in the title. So what it's doing is it's declaring an argument is needed in this setting. With respect to the opinions of mankind, this requires us to declare the reasons or causes of this proposed separation, the laws of nature and nature's God, entitle them to equal station, which means that there are laws of nature and nature's God. This is a government document, by the way, right? Are you okay with government documents saying things like that? Get your IRS form for the year. It says, because of the laws of nature and nature's God, we've determined the following. Or you want to dismiss that. Probably many people today would just say, oh, it's just a nice rhetorical flourish. No, it's central to the argument that's being made. Once you take that out, that's the basic beliefs. You try to remove those and keep this up here, that's the sand. It's now going to crumble. It won't work. And that's what's happened in the time since then. Challenges have been raised about all of the things that the Declaration of Independence claims. The laws of nature have been challenged. Now usually people mean by that the empirical laws studied by the empirical sciences. Laws of nature. So things like gravity, we can drop a lot of things and measure them and see how fast they fall. But that's not quite what was meant here. It doesn't not mean that, but it doesn't only mean that. Laws of the nature of things. Things have laws because they have natures. They are something. In contrast to just a kind of radical nominalism that says there's only particulars. Things have natures. And God is the God of nature. Again, not just like God of streams and forests. God's the God of nature because God creates the nature of things. God's eternal, by implication, right? There's a creation without beginning and created all other things. Those follow from just that line. The Declaration recognizes that an argument is required to explain separation, but also we'll have to see what assumptions it rests on. An argument's required for those as well. The opinions of mankind have to be addressed about those also. So the argument begins with what the authors take to be basic, self-evident truths. And one of the problems is, strictly speaking, these are not self-evident. And much of the history of America is about challenges that have come up about these truths. In what sense they can be taken as self-evident. And I want to help us think through some of those challenges today and how they work. So here's an example. It's not self-evident that God exists. Now you might be very convinced that God exists, and it might be true that God exists, and you have a sound argument to show it. But that's not the same as saying it's self-evident, is it? The very fact that you give an argument shows it isn't self-evident. It may indeed be clear, but you'd have to show it. And this is indeed getting us to these idea of foundational truths and the reality, our beliefs about reality and how they rest on those. So let me read that portion from the Declaration of Independence, which you all know. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I want to draw your attention to three things here. First, the laws of nature and nature's God. Second, the need to give an argument. And third, the foundational truths. And I'm actually going to start with number 3 and work backwards. Yeah, good. Self-evident, all men are created equal, and value of rights. See how this illustrates those 3 truths. Foundational truths. Claim about how we know things. What's the authority? And really, you do need to begin there at what's self-evident. Now, that they got it wrong doesn't change that formal truth. We see how that's where Aristotle begins also. I might mention him later on that point in the metaphysics about the laws of thought, the law of non-contradiction particularly. But he does the same thing. You start with what's self-evident, and that law is self-evident. You can't argue for it, he says. You'd be using it to argue for it. So that's actually what is meant by self-evident, what Aristotle's doing. So starting with that third one. So in this line, we have stated the order. This is what I love about the Declaration of Independence. It gets that order down. It starts with epistemology. I've been saying knowledge, same thing, right? Study of knowledge. And then it goes to what is real, God and humans. And then it goes to the values that it's arguing for in that order. And that's a very important order. And these truths are about, as I said, God and humans as created by God. So there's a relationship there. Not just there's God and there's humans, but there's an order. and what is valuable in life, and how what is valuable comes last because it rests on those truths about reality. So again, what if you remove those truths and try to keep the values? Well, that logical order is now gone. And you'll lose the meaning of them. Think of how the word happiness has changed meaning since then to now, as you remove the idea of a goal, telos, an order, an end made by God. So on that argument rests all the rest of the argument, the actual argument we haven't got to yet of the declaration, right? That comes next. All that stuff rests on this part. And the majority of the declaration is not dedicated to this part, but only makes its case insofar as it gets these truths right. So this is the argument I was referring to in point 2. Again, I was going to look at point 1, the laws of nature and nature's God. Then point 2, that you need to give an argument to support your case. And then third was the foundational truths we just looked at. So coming to point 2 now, you have to give an argument. That's what it means to appeal to reason. Not necessarily reasons, because your reasons might be insufficient. Or reasoning. If you teach logic at all, like I do, you'll know that a great percentage of our reasoning is fallacious. So it's not enough to say, well, that's my reason, or here's how I reasoned it out. Isn't that what the math teachers have us do, is put down our work? And I was one of those who always, I hate putting down my work, right? No. How did you get here? That matters. So your argument, what is your argument? And we need to give an argument to support our foundational truths. Not only because bald assertion isn't knowledge, minimally to yourself, right? You might wonder to yourself, why do I still believe this? My parents told me it's true. But then you might think of other things they said that are true that you don't agree with. So why should I agree with this one still? Or my tradition says it's true, but there's lots of traditions. Some of them must be wrong. So minimally to ourselves, we have to give an argument, right? Why to continue to believe this, let alone when challenges are raised from the outside. Now, the outside could be within our culture. That's the suicide Lincoln spoke of. But it could also be from another culture to our culture. Another culture says, why do you guys do it that way? It's not a very good way to do it. We have a better way to do it. So challenges then are about the meaning of what you believe. Those beliefs aren't meaningful. And certainly that has been raised about belief in God since the time of the Declaration. It's not a meaningful belief. I can get along just fine without God. In fact, I'll do better than others have done with God. And that's an important challenge you'd have to deal with. And that gets us to point 1. The laws of nature and nature's God. What role that plays. This is not the demiurge who simply fashions things that already exist to appear like the forms. And it's not the many gods who contend with each other in their lusts and greed. This is God, the creator of all things. He brought them into existence, doesn't just fashion them. And God gives laws because he is the creator of the nature of things. It's in that act of giving things natures that he establishes the laws of things. So what role does that play? That's a central role to the rest of the argument. Change that and you'll change the outcome. So you have these 3 areas, foundational truths. How do we know what is real and what is good? And yet it seems there's this problem in the Declaration that it has come down to us even in the present day. And you'll see it as people debate. I don't know if you use, what's it called, Facebook? Have you heard of that? I guess it's popular in some circles. And you can use it for sociological reasons. That's what I do. To observe the way in which people argue. And so it's come down to the present day that we assert as self-evident our opinions, when they actually aren't self-evident, but it doesn't help to point it out to the person. So a problem that makes it impossible to simply return to the Declaration of Independence. It's not self-evident that God exists. Now you might say, come on, Dr. Anderson, it doesn't say that. It's self-evident that men are created equal. Yeah, with the emphasis here on the word created. Try to take God out and have created equal some other way. That's an important act because it's in that act that the equality rests. It's not equality of outcomes or something like that. It's equality of the nature of things. Or perhaps by self-evident they simply meant commonly accepted by all in the discussion. And that may very well have been at the time. It was doubtful. It'd be about 100 years too late to say that. When Thomas Hobbes was writing, people didn't believe he could be an atheist. There aren't any. That's like a unicorn. There are no atheists. By this time, you've got Thomas Paine running around. He'd probably say he's a deist. The God of nature, right? He liked that talk. So we have challenges now where it may not have even been accepted by all in the discussion at that time. And why not? Because other beliefs are being put in its place in an attempt to find meaning. The idea is that this doesn't help me find meaning, this other thing will. So there's a two-part process, right? Challenging the belief, say in God, and then replacing it with something else. But we'll have to notice both things going on. Because presumably you could replace a false belief with another false belief. Or you could replace a true belief with a false belief, right? So just replacing something, like the word revolution as revolve. And you get a picture of a hamster so diligently racing on the wheel. Revolution just doesn't get you anywhere, does it? Say, oh good, it's time for another revolution. Another revolution. And again, until the end of time. All amounting to nothing. So you want there to be some end or goal to which things are aiming. Simply returning to what has already been done may not work. So what appeared self-evident but wasn't won't help after those challenges. So how do these challenges work? Here's an example we've been talking about. It's not self-evident that God exists. I'm not saying God doesn't exist. I'm talking about the epistemology of it. But it may very well be clear that God exists. You can give an argument about that. Have a whole book on that if you are in the mood of buying books. So what is in the place of God in this system? The creator of all things in the system that's replacing belief in God. You don't get away from that role just because you replace it, right? You might say, not that, instead this. Well, what is it then that you're putting in that place? We can examine that and see if it's been replaced with something meaningful or not. And that's what it means to get into foundational truths and begin to argue about them and the reality on which the rest is built. Now, let's go back quickly to Lincoln, who says in the fragment from his speech on the Constitution, has some things here to say about liberty that I want to touch on. He understands the principle of liberty to all to be that which is at the back of the rest of it all and close to the human heart. He says, and this is not the result of accident. It has a philosophical cause. That gets my attention, right? As a philosopher, I like philosophical causes. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result. But even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. The expression of that principle in our Declaration of Independence was most happy and fortunate. Without this, as well as with it, we could have declared our independence of Great Britain, but without it, we could not, I think, have secured our free government and consequent prosperity. So it's the assertion of that principle at that time, that was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. So this principle of liberty for all, will liberty be sufficient? Remember, it was put in a temple, the place of the divine. Now, something can be very important and you don't put it in the temple, right? So it's not a matter of, I say, oh, he hates liberty. Those guys at ASU. No. What will keep it from libertinism? Hedonism. Raising up a bunch of Epicureans, which actually is kind of put down to Epicurus, right? He says, that's not what I said. So if liberty is our highest value, we're putting it in the place of the good, instead of it being a means, at most, a means to the good. If you don't know what is good, you'll misuse your liberty. Think of the things that are done today in the name of liberty, and you somehow go back in time and say, hey, President Lincoln, look what will be done in the name of liberty. You say, yeah, it makes sense. I don't think. I'd be like, what? So we need to get in place what is good still. There's been a theme here. What will be done in the name of liberty? I'd say the things that Lincoln would never have imagined. So how do we get that in place? The good, our highest good. If liberty is to do anything, it will only be in the service of that. Otherwise, you could have civil liberties while not actually being free to pursue the good because you don't know what it is. So what good are the civil liberties to you? And then we won't be able to make just laws because we don't know what is good and just. So we could have freedom to make or repeal laws and not know what to do, not be doing it correctly, therefore, because we don't know what is good and just. That's what we need to get in place. Now, the Declaration of Independence makes an appeal to the laws of nature. What is this law of nature? For that, I want to go back a little further to John Winthrop and his 1630 sermon aboard the Arbella, Model of Christian Charity. Here we have one of the earliest examples in the English colonies and the history that leads to the American Revolution. And so if you're a history teacher, you'll say, well, wait a minute, there's a continuity still between English and American. Yes, I know, I agree. But just thinking, like, how early can you go in the English colonies in North America? This is about as early as you go for articulated thought about this. And we're going to see some patterns that come down all the way from that time through the persons I've already looked at to us. Some patterns in American thought that helps us to become conscious of those. Winthrop is explaining what is needed for society to maintain itself, and his answer is love or charity, model of Christian charity. We use that word somewhat differently now, right? Charity and love, especially when we emphasize love these days, doesn't mean what he meant by love. So keep that in mind. Probably if you're doing your Greek, you'll know what's meant here by love. It would be interesting to consider why this answer is different than the one Lincoln gives about liberty. I have to remind myself it's not like a fire alarm, right? Why doesn't John Winthrop say liberty? After all, he's a separatist. He's leaving for religious liberty. Why does he say charity? Be interesting that there's another. I'm throwing out senior papers here left and right. There's another one, right? Compare those two speeches. Now, there's a similarity in both, though, that I want to emphasize, which is that they're guided by law. For Winthrop, love is not simply doing what makes another feel nice for a few moments, as we're getting at about love today. That's how it's often meant. Love has to do with knowing what we owe the other, even our enemy. To be just is to treat equals as equals, to give to each what they are due. And so far, you can hear the Republic. I don't think he's referencing it, but you see similarity about what justice is, but he departs from that because it is in doing what is good for the other according to the law. And about the law, he says this: there is likewise a double law by which we are regulated in our conversations towards one another. Yes, thank you. You're the best. So, regulated in conversations towards another. In both the former respects, the law of nature and the law of grace. Now he's bringing in something else that we hadn't heard about in the Declaration. Winthrop develops the law of nature as based in the ideas of justice, or of equals being treated equally. He gives a number of examples. Most of the body of the text is examples about that. But of each of us is equal. We're each equally human. Right? That's where we get to the idea of the nature of things, because we're not equal in many other respects. So clearly that's not what it means. We're equally human, though, sharing that human nature. And because we're equally human, we have this idea of justice between each other. So he says, by the first of these laws, man, as he was enabled, so withal, is commanded to love his neighbor as himself. Each of us is equal, and so each of us deserve the same love I have for myself. If I love myself as human, with that same love I love you as human. But this law of nature, he says, is not sufficient in purpose or in detail at this time. Something has happened to interrupt our original state. The law of nature was given to man, this is him, in the estate of innocence. This is the gospel in the estate of regeneracy, or this of the gospel in the state of regeneracy. So the law of nature in the state of innocence, this law of grace or gospel of grace in the law of in the state of regeneracy. The law of nature would give no rules for dealing with enemies, for all are to be considered as friends in the state of innocence. But the gospel commands love to an enemy. So, what's happened here? How's he developing this? So it's because of sin that there are enemies in the world, right? If you didn't have sin, if you're in the state of innocence, you just have friends, no enemies to love. So you don't yet have to have a law about enemies. Now, sometimes when you speak of enemies, one person is doing what is right and the other is doing what is wrong, but sometimes they're both doing what's wrong. That could be the case under the state of sin. They're just all doing what is right in their own eyes, and none of them are actually right. But either way, in this reality of sin and the need to not only live together, which is loving our neighbors, but also to be redeemed from that sin, we now have a harder problem in the political realm and the cultural realm. It's not just that first straightforward problem, how do we manage resources and live together? Political, economic, right? Now it's this additional problem about redemption. People aren't doing what is right. So even if you came up with a great theme, a scheme of how to manage limited resources, economics, people may not do it. So what do we do? This is the law of grace that he spoke of. If there's sin, liberty and solid political structures won't be enough. And that's why I said if, because there'll be those who say there isn't. There's just other things like lack of education or poverty. Once you cure those, then you're fine. There's not some additional problem. That's outdated thinking. So if there is this other thing, sin, then it wouldn't be enough to get the political and the economic. You'd also have to speak about what to do about sin. Similarly, if there is sin, then simply doing education is not enough. Education, at best, still makes my heart kind of, so it's a little bit of a jump. It's good. It's like caffeine kind of, I guess, right? I'm still awake. I'm still alive. Similarly, so education is not enough. You say, whoa. You're here to talk up education, pal. Well, at best, what education will do is help us become aware of our condition. Although many times it doesn't even do that, right? It alerts us to some other, maybe limited condition or not actual condition. So we were created in one condition, but we've fallen into another condition, which raises new problems for us. How do we live in this fallen condition, and how can we be redeemed? These are the laws that Winthrop speaks about and themes that continue through American thought. The need for grace raises a problem for us as humans that is different than the need for religious liberty. The need for grace means we have a need to be forgiven, redeemed. It means we have violated the law and we're guilty. Not just that there is a law, and if we crank it down and perfect it, things will be good. That's one of these dystopian novels waiting to be written. There's 1,000 of them. Well, even if you did have the law, you've broken it. You're guilty in violation of it. So Winthrop describes the end or final goal of the law this way. The end is to improve our lives, to do more service to the Lord, the comfort and increase of the body of Christ, whereof we are members, that ourselves and posterity may be the better preserved from the common corruptions of this evil world, to serve the Lord and work out our salvation under the power and purity of his holy ordinances. Now this complicates then the problem of how to have lasting institutions. And you might say that sounds like we're veering into revealed religion in a public education setting, because I'm a public educator. Well, no, not necessarily. Noting that there is a law of nature that I've broken, and therefore I have a new need, is not the same yet as getting to the answer of how that need will be addressed. That first part's all just still natural religion, still part of the discussion. So we may think it's enough to turn to some kind of humanism, and there's actually arguments between humanists. There's classical humanists who would say if we go back to the stories that the Greeks have, this would teach us the best way to live. But there are secular humanists that teach us modern science and materialism and its miracles will teach us the best way to live. But grace adds something else to those. As I said, grace is needed because there's been a law that's broken, precisely because of the situation Lincoln was describing. You realize there's a breakdown. The situation Paul Tillich was describing, there's a breakdown that has occurred. The law of nature is what described for us how to achieve what is good, meaning we haven't done it yet. The very fact of divisions between us means we haven't done it yet. And I know we'll say of ourselves, I'm on the right side, they're on the wrong side. Potentially, you're both on the wrong side. But minimally, we're not in agreement yet, meaning we haven't been seeking what we should have sought. We've put something else in the place of the good. That's actually why I had Aeneas on the cover of The Natural Moral Law. The subtitle is The Good After Modernity. And you see Aeneas carried Anchises, and Anchises is reaching back to grab one of his household idols, which will then go on to be what founds the ideology of Rome. But behind him, even further, is Troy burning. Now, maybe an American pragmatist. The household idol sure didn't do you much good, pal. Why waste time saving that? Cast it on the flames as you leave, right? But instead, you're going to take that same idolatry and bring it into the next institutions. What have we put in the place of God? So in this sermon by Winthrop, we don't see him developing that. Instead, we get some of the categories that are formative to American thought, even to the present, and we see a tension between reason and the affections. I mentioned that earlier, that theme. And we also see that the law of nature and the law of grace are set in distinction, which is another common thing in American thought. Rather than there being one comprehensive moral law that applies in all areas of life, and we need redemption to be restored to it. So just from that one speech, you'll get so much of what happens later in American thought. Categories that American thought gets pushed into. The law of nature being the moral law, which is perpetual and binding on all, and that law of grace is not an addition to it. You're loving your neighbor, and then you say, well, you're adding on loving your enemy, but what is the same is the love of the other, which is the seeking of the good for the other. So one law, love the other. So he says this, the way to draw men to the works of mercy is not by force of argument from the goodness or necessity of the work, for though this cause may enforce a rational mind to some present act of mercy, as is frequent in the experience, yet it cannot work such a habit in the soul as shall make it prompt upon all occasions to produce the same effect, but by framing these affections of love in the heart, which will as naturally bring forth the other as any cause does produce the effect. So how do we get that habit into our soul? Well, by framing the affections of love in the heart. And there's some echoes there in what Lincoln said as well. What is the role of reason then? We need to establish the foundation by reason that we then get into place with habit. Otherwise, you could have habits that are bad habits. People recognize that, right? Well, how do you know if they're good or bad? Well, if they're aimed at the good or not. So you have to know that first, and it's by reason we do this. We form beliefs, and we establish that foundation. And it's in this context that Winthrop tells his audience that there'll be a city on a hill. Their foundations will be tested for all the rest to see. Did they build on a lasting foundation? Or, to phrase it slightly differently, did they get the foundation in place, which means they had each piece where it goes and fit together to support the others? Now, since he's in Massachusetts, we could reference Harvard. And when Harvard was founded, the rules for the student, the first one was that they should know the biblical languages. The second rule was that the purpose of the student was to pursue the knowledge of God. And say, yeah, that sounds like Harvard today, right? Almost perfect continuity from 1636 to the present Harvard. Princeton, that's the newcomer, that was its first rule because it's coming out of the First Great Awakening. The student should love the knowledge of God and piety. When I was there, I asked the students that, are you here to study the knowledge of God and piety? I didn't tell them it was in their charter. No, of course not. So what happened to that foundation then? Where did it go? What challenges have been raised that weren't addressed? And that will happen for the rest, any other foundation as well. It will be a city on a hill in the sense that the foundations will be exposed to those same challenges. Did we get to lasting foundation? That's what we want in our education. That's what we want for our students, for ourselves. Lasting education. Now, in the paper, I now talk about Madison. I'm going to briefly mention him in Federalist 10, where he speaks about factions. So coming back from Winthrop to Madison now. And he talks about factions and what to do with them. He takes factions just as a given. There are factions, that's right. But the philosopher asks the normative question, should there be factions? How can we no longer have factions? Now, one of the things that he has them there is because of the difference between passion and reason. And so there just will be people who rely on passion more, and there'll be factions. But he also has a kind of skepticism about our ability to know religious truths. Mostly religion is passion. Reason only comes in a little bit. And so you're going to have a framework, you're going to have a system that allows there to be these differences that exist because you can't get further. Now, we don't do that in math. Maybe at some higher level, maybe we have the non-Euclideans around still. But normally think about math, you don't have the 2 + 2 is 5 faction in math. That's an incorrect, right? And you can imagine your students raising up and saying, no, we believe it's 5 and therefore it is. Wouldn't matter. When you have knowledge, you don't have factions. So do we have to accept a kind of skepticism about our ability to have knowledge? The point here is that we want to help our students learn about reason and how to construct an argument so they can have knowledge of basic things. And knowledge is required for the kind of unity us in philosophy might envy in math. We look over at the 2 + 2 = 4 answer and say, oh, I'm so envious. Well, because they have knowledge and we haven't yet got it. So what has happened if you've had this long, if you were given a system which provides you with the opportunity to debate those who disagree with, and after more than 2 centuries, you haven't even come to know the highest good, one of the first truths. Well, that's not a good situation, right? Why not? It's not meant to be perpetual, unending debate, like say in math, it would be unending debate about 2 + 2. No, you're meant to come to an answer about it. So we've been using the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln, Madison, Winthrop, to illustrate the role of foundational truths in a political institution, but also in education. Let's see, what's the next one? Yeah, let me mention this at least also, because this is the proof for his skepticism. As long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at the liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. So that seems to be a good descriptive and pragmatic answer, American pragmatism. Right? There just are these things. There's these differences. You might maybe try to get Plato in there too. One version of Plato, the horses, but the other version of Plato is in the Meno, where he unites them. I would have talked about that. I have that in the paper as well, the Meno. But notice what he does. In order to say as long as the reason of man continues fallible, he's using reason to describe that it's fallible. See, I mentioned that earlier, that self-referential problem, which is why Aristotle says we can't argue for the laws of thought. You'd be using them. You can only give a negative argument. So why do we have to think that it is true? I say, oh, Anderson's claiming not to be fallible. No, of course. Humans make mistakes. We need a system that provides for that and checks those mistakes on each other. But that does not preclude that we can actually come to have knowledge of these things. Humans are fallible in math also, and they come to have knowledge. So we've been using these documents, these speeches, to illustrate that role of foundational truths and make the case that this is what we're doing in education. We're trying to get that foundation in place, get a lasting foundation for our students. I don't suppose anyone would say, I only want a temporary foundation that lasts about 20, 25 years. And how the Declaration lines that out so well. Epistemology, metaphysics, ethics. But also we look back to how Winthrop does that and speaks about there also being this other problem of the law of grace. Now when we began, we were looking at a quote from Paul Tillich and the miserable condition it described. We have to remember that he was writing just after the end of those 2 world wars, and we know the Civil War that Lincoln went through, and those are serious consequences. And there are serious consequences when we're divided on foundational truths. Those divisions don't always stay academic. That's the area I like to stay in. They can become heated. So the way to avoid that is to pay attention and not think those same kinds of consequences will never happen again. We want, I think intuitively, and then by argument here, we want and need a lasting foundation, both for ourselves and our students. So let me conclude. Where I originally had 3 challenges that face us, let me provide 3 conclusions. We have that next. Yeah. Teach our students to pursue unity by knowing what is good. We want unity between people, that we need to know what is good, the highest good, the summum bonum. That's the first thing. That was actually the very first question I was taught in my very first college class. And I had never heard it before. I'm not putting any blame on my K through 12 teachers. I had fantastic teachers, some of the best teachers. But why hadn't I been asked that before in K to 12? What's the highest good? Thankfully, I was asked it that first day in college because I know other students who went through their PhDs in philosophy and were never asked that question. I remember you might say, well, aren't they reading Plato? I know, that's part of my, I remember raising that question to one of my analytic philosophy professors. Great guy. But I said, we're going over meta-ethics. And I said, well, what about Plato? I think I mentioned the Meno. And he said, well, Plato believed in reincarnation. Back to the 20th century. End of Plato. So teach our students to pursue unity by knowing what is good. Second, teach our students to think critically so they can test competing beliefs. Are you able to recognize the beliefs of those you disagree with? That's simple. I think it's a very simple skill, but it's increasingly gone. You're not able to articulate what your opponent thinks. I don't mean you. When I look at you and say, oh, it means me. Remember, I'm doing sociological research on Facebook. The Facebookites, is that what they're called? Don't know how to do this. So teach our students to think critically so they can identify these competing beliefs. And then third, teach our students to love this process. Here's passions. In case you think I'm just a cold philosopher, you look up there and you think you see Spock. No, to teach our students to love this process by exemplifying it ourselves. They'll love what we love. We can't fake that. They'll notice that. They're very good at noticing that. So we ourselves must know what is the highest good. We must love the good. We must love wisdom. So while Lincoln asked us to look back to the founding, we went back even further and saw that there were these challenges present from the earliest English colonies. We've seen a theme about foundational truths on which a society builds, and these are truths about knowledge and authority, about origins and what is eternal, about value and really the highest value. These will be challenged, have been challenged, and the challenge is about the truth, the meaning of those beliefs. So we can't simply reassert that. That becomes just bald assertion. If they do not provide meaning to the next generation, if they didn't provide meaning to us, they certainly won't to them. Sometimes we keep things around because we're used to it. It's too hard to change it, but we know it's meaningless. The next one definitely won't because it's not too hard for them to change it. So if they don't provide meaning to the next generation, if they only give the appearance of meaning, they'll be rejected. A lasting foundation is necessary for lasting meaning. So while it may sometimes seem like today there is no meaning, remembering Paul Tillich's quote, no foundations, this is an opportunity to get that lasting foundation in place. Think of Nehemiah. 2 pieces of work, clearing the rubble and then rebuilding, right? It's easiest if it's already identified as rubble. If there's some debate about it, no, that's not rubble. What are you doing? But if it's all just, okay, that's all rubble, good, clear it out. And get this lasting thing in place. So the challenge is about the truth and the meaning of these beliefs. Let's restore that lasting foundation and give it permanent footing with sound arguments. Let's learn to identify beliefs in each of the factions we think of involved right now, using Madison's term, factions. Not just setting each of them aside as too passionate, but what do they believe? From where do their passions arise? Passion is like your energy directed at something you think is good. So what do you think is good? And then we can come to unity by pursuing knowledge rather than just asserting opinion. Whatever other disagreements exist, all people want a meaningful life. And we can teach that by learning it ourselves and demonstrating our love for it to our students. Thank you.
Professor Anderson, thank you very much for uncovering the foundations for us. We have just a few minutes for just a couple questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, please. That's the best part.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to ask that the audience take a few moments to consider if you have a question, and I'm going to ask for one from you in just a moment. But first, we have a question from online. And I ask that you repeat the question into the microphone so that they can hear it online as well. The question online, Professor Anderson, do you think that education in America today undermines piety for our students? And is there any way forward for education to inculcate a sense of piety in students?
Good question. Does education in America today undermine piety, and is there a way to inculcate piety in our students going forward? And it's a good question in itself, but isn't it a really good question for a sun devil? Right? Like, of all the persons on earth to ask about piety, that's probably the last person you want to ask, right? Well, no, I suppose I would know more about it because my competitors in Tucson are the Wildcats, and animals don't know about it either way. So a sun devil at least knows what it is to avoid it. Piety, right? But let me address piety. Piety means the love of God. Right? What does Aeneas love to go around saying? It's like his mantra. I am pious Aeneas. Whatever God says to do, I do. Now, if you've got the wrong God, ooh, mistake. So you got to make sure you check that one, right? Piety is not, you can't appeal to it in itself, Aeneas. You could have maybe a debate between, say, Calvin and Aeneas. That'd be a good one. Calvin beginning his institutes by saying humans are idol factories. Now, so piety, the love of God, I'm going to call that a formal thing, meaning everyone is pious toward what they take to be in that place. Does that make sense? And incidentally, I just happened to mention Calvin, but that's kind of his point there. Everyone has, formally speaking, something they put in the place of God, and so they're going to be pious with respect to that thing. So I think here's where I would do it, and aware of some terms like God get sensitive in public school settings, but you're really still doing natural philosophy, natural religion or philosophy of religion, because you're raising questions about what is that highest value? Toward what is your life aimed? Is your life aimed at more than being a gastropod? You're good at doing one thing, but that's it? Are you more than that as a human? So that seems to be a great way to begin to ask the question. Now, the other one was about, is American education contrary to that? We might have a view of neutrality in education that is, because we think to be neutral means we can't talk about any of these topics. And we do our students a disservice then in two ways. One is we don't teach them how to agree or disagree correctly, right? We don't even bring it up. It's too sensitive. Don't bring up the fact that all humans in history have disagreed about this. Well, what do we bring up then? And then secondly, we don't teach them how to reason to the truth either. So that's a problem about avoiding disagreements. The two topics you don't talk about at family get-togethers, right? They told me that, religion and politics, and so I picked one of them and said, I'm going to major in that, right? Just kind of a disagreeable person. So piety, piety and the knowledge of God, Princeton. You couldn't say that today. You couldn't say that at ASU. I don't know if you know this, but over our football stadium, over the opponent's entrance, it says, let those who enter here abandon hope. And I've joked about, well, that could be over the university's entrance, right? As Sun Devils. Next question?
Yes, sure. We'll take a question from the live audience here. Are there any questions?
That's what you want as a speaker. All questions were settled. Yeah, good question, because there's something called new natural law theory. John Finnis and Robert George and others who would say you can do natural law. It's more of a kind of pragmatic reasoning about means and ends. You don't need to do the metaphysical speculation that comes from old natural law, which tends to be from Thomas Aquinas. So there is that tension, that question. I think when you start to argue about means and ends, you inevitably get into questions about what is real. So you inevitably end up in arguments about, like I gave the example before, if you're pursuing a career in unicorn hunting. Well, those aren't real, right? So it's not enough to have an end in mind. You also have to know what is real and what is lasting, what is permanent. So I wouldn't go right to say natural law requires God, because the term God is so ambiguous and loaded. But it requires us to know what is real and permanent. That's, I think, within all of our scope of teaching, isn't it? Even starting in kindergarten, aren't you teaching about what is real? On up to 12, and then you hand them over to me, and I keep doing that. So natural law requires knowing what is real. Other questions? One over here, one over here.
We're going to have to cut it, I think. Because we can take one more.
One. I'll get whichever one I don't get, we'll do afterwards.
Miss Owen.
Okay, forgive me if I misheard you. When you were talking about the Declaration of Independence and you were saying self-evident truths, did I hear you say that they actually got something wrong about what was self-evident?
Well, just at the claim, it's self-evident that all men are created equal isn't a self-evident statement. Many people have doubted that. The next century is filled with origin stories where we're not equal. Right? The motivating piece of movement in Darwinism is survival of the fittest. Right? And you get a kind of nominalism in science which doesn't allow for natures to things. There's only particular things. There's not really actually a nature. So you can't have equality of that kind anymore. So that's a challenge that's come up since. And that's why most people treat it as a nice flourish to the rest of the document. They don't actually get into natural theology there, which is what I'm trying to do in my book. Because most people say, yeah, clearly not. Let's move on. It's a nice way of starting out a discussion.
Well, thank you, Professor Anderson. If you could give one more round of applause.
Thank you.